The Doctor Who specials caused audiences to leave in droves, while the BBC's latest Agatha Christie adaptation not only race-bent its lead, it brought ideo-political social commentary into the mix, and it did so in a way which was neither part of nor in keeping with the original story. Against this backdrop, the BBC has been accused of breaching its own impartiality rules in favor of woke bias. And the only way anyone outside the UK knows anything about this is because industry trade/mouthpiece Deadline Hollywood instantly ran cover and rubbished all charges. Without ever having detailed the accusations against them. In the early hours of December 28th, Deadline Hollywood instantly ran cover for the BBC with their story, BBC dunks on research accusing it of feeding viewers a diet of woke bias. The Deadline Hollywood story reads, "The BBC has criticised research accusing the UK broadcaster of peddling viewers a steady diet of woke bias, including news about slavery and gender diversity storylines in drama." The BBC accused the Campaign for Common Sense, a group that advocates for freedom of expression, of cherry-picking examples of so-called woke issues from thousands of hours of output. The Campaign for Common Sense has yet to publish its research, but the group appears to have collated examples of content that has upset relatively small numbers of viewers. The BBC said it did not constitute analysis. Well, from Deadline Hollywood's recounting, it seems that these were pointless charges and the BBC has this well in hand, but let's read on. Findings were shared with the Daily Telegraph, which reported that the Campaign for Common Sense surveyed BBC content in an attempt to expose bias over issues including race and gender. Okay, so to sum up so far, Deadline Hollywood has ran to the BBC's defense, publishing their response, all while tacitly dismissing and belittling the accusations. The only clue the reader is given to find these accusations is that they were published in the Daily Telegraph, which interestingly, Deadline Hollywood does not link to. But with that clue, I was able to find the original story myself, and I think I'd rather read the accusations there than Deadline Hollywood's recounting of them, which, to be fair, is just a little bit further down the page. Heading over to the Daily Telegraph then, in their December 27 story, BBC feeds viewers a diet of woke bias in breach of its own impartiality rules, campaigners say. The BBC has been accused of feeding viewers a steady diet of woke bias, as research suggests the broadcaster has failed to uphold standards in its own impartiality plan. Well, now that puts a different spin on matters. Funny how Deadline Hollywood didn't mention that, at least not early in the story, you know, where readers make up their minds about the story. But moving on. A survey of the corporation's news and drama output has exposed bias in coverage of debates over race and gender, campaigners say, while the BBC News website has averaged more than one article per week on the slave trade. A former cultured secretary reacted to the findings by saying that the BBC must be vigilant against the danger of being captured by fringe interests. In recent days, the BBC has come under fire for adding scenes to the Agatha Christie thriller Murder is Easy to make it an allegory for colonialism. But why is this a problem? Can't the BBC do what they want? Well, the article continues. It comes 2 years after BBC Director General Tim Davie launched a 10-point plan to ensure impartiality. Mr. Davie said viewers expected the highest standards of impartiality, accuracy, and trust. I'm curious, BBC viewers, do you trust the BBC to be impartial and accurate? Let me know in the comments. Moving on, but a review of BBC output by the Campaign for Common Sense suggests the corporation is failing to uphold those standards when it comes to its drama and news output. Does that mean there's more to the BBC than its drama and news output? Because I thought that's all there was. But anyway, moving on. The research exposed a preoccupation by BBC News about Britain's links to the transatlantic slave trade, with articles about the subject appearing online at a rate of more than one a week in 2023. As of September, the BBC News website had featured 55 separate stories about slavery, ranging from how a flood led family to discover slavery link to Jamaicans' call for Gladstone slavery reparations. That's ironic, considering that it was the UK which ended the transatlantic slave trade. And after the Telegraph cited numerous more examples of bias, politicians weigh in. Baroness Morgan, the former culture secretary, told the Telegraph, "Given its important role in covering issues affecting all of us, the BBC always needs to remain vigilant against being captured by fringe interests." A spokesman for the Campaign for Common Sense said, "This research reveals that, rather than upholding those high standards of impartiality, parts of the BBC continue to peddle a steady diet of woke bias, both through the plot lines of popular dramas, but also in some of its news coverage." The impartiality plan, unveiled in the wake of a BBC scandal over trust, was supposed to mark a turning point for the corporation. Instead, this research reveals the same old woke worldview is still very much in operation. 2 years ago, the BBC set itself very high standards to help restore viewers' trust. It has singularly failed to meet those standards. Then more details is given about those behind the study. The Campaign for Common Sense, which champions free speech and tolerance, was founded by Mark Lehane, who went on to become an advisor to Nadim Zahavi when he was Education Secretary. In other words, this report comes from political circles, or at the very least politically adjacent circles. As such, it's going to meet some minimum requirements of reliability and veracity, and should not be dismissed outright. The report goes on to record that in January, BBC News was accused of portraying illegal immigration in a sympathetic light, while in May it interviewed a woman who called for the government to pay and support disabled people to access prostitutes. The same month, it posted an article exploring Satanism, featuring advocates who claimed it had helped them with logic and empathy. Many more examples are cited, including a report on how black women were more likely to die in the plague in, get this, 14th century London due to structural racism, before the article concludes with the response from a BBC spokesperson saying, "Cherry-picking a handful of examples or highlighting genuine mistakes in thousands of hours of output does not constitute analysis and is not a true representation of BBC content. We are proud that our output seeks to represent all audiences and a range of stories and perspectives." Across the entirety of our services, there will, of course, be occasions when people disagree with or want to challenge what they have watched or heard, and we have well-publicized routes for them to do that. That's code for shut up, stop complaining, and watch what we have decreed is good for you. That aside, when I, that don't even have the BBC, can cite examples that weren't even listed here, then this isn't cherry-picking, this is a pattern, and it's structural. More than that, I question the claim that all audiences and stories are being represented. I do get the impression that some are more represented than others. But again, I'd love to hear what actual BBC viewers feel about this in the comments. Either way, this is basically a canned response. The BBC can't really say anything else. The alternative would be to admit that, yep, that 10-point plan to assure impartiality was just bullshit, we didn't do any of that. And yet, that canned response was the basis for Deadline Hollywood's article. To be fair to Deadline Hollywood, they did provide an even more abbreviated retelling of the accusations than I did here, but they did leave out a lot of context, and they did not provide a link to the source article where that context was provided, and their angle remains that the accusations leveled against the BBC were pointless. What that goes to show is that not only is there an overwhelming degree of likelihood of woke bias in the BBC, but, as we all intuitively know, within the Hollywood establishment as well, as industry trade Deadline Hollywood were so eager to run to the BBC's defense. I'll soon be adding to those accusations against the BBC myself, as our next regular video, with the old intro and everything, will be my takedown, retrospective and post-mortem of David Tennant's Around the World in 80 woke and self-flagellating days. That series should have told everyone right off the bat that David Tennant returning to Doctor Who wasn't a sign of change, but a red flag, a warning of things to come. Do check back for that video soon in case you don't get a notification, and for now, let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comments.